Thank you, Tara. It's a pleasure to be here again with you. And I want to thank you and Sarah Lindstrom and Roberti, who's the Framingham State side of the lifelong learning series for their help. Uh, those of you who've seen me give one of the talks or have seen me driving my children around Framingham, I am a Framingham resident in addition to teaching at Framingham State. Um, I will add my reminder about muting for everyone's safety. Um, and yeah, let's go ahead and get started. I have to share the slides and say that I'm sharing the slides as Zoom protocol dictates. So I want to start tonight with what I assume or probably is the most familiar piece of the story, which is the First Amendment, which I'm guessing most of you are at least a little familiar with what just happened. Um, I'm sorry, something very weird is happening with my laptop. Um, okay. Um, So the familiar part of the story, I'm guessing at least a little for most of you, is the First Amendment itself, uh, which just as a reminder and refresher says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So, in the process of revising down what had been about 100 proposed amendments, the first federal Congress compressed a series of related rights into this one amendment, which means it's actually kind of hard to see what it specifically says about the press. So, I conveniently pulled everything else out. So, the press clause, if we just pull this, is Congress shall make no law respecting the freedom of the press. Okay. That text became part of the Constitution when the Bill of Rights was ratified on December 15th, 1791, and Americans have been arguing about what it meant since December 16th, 1791. Actually, that's not quite true. They didn't even agree what it meant on the day it was actually ratified. Uh, so how did the Constitution end up with protection for the press, with for one particular trade? This is a very rare instance in the Constitution where the text is very specific about who it's protecting, who it's regarding. And why did Americans in the ratification conventions and then in Congress want to protect freedom of the press, and what the heck do they mean? I'm happy. I know that the First Amendment has many clauses. I'm happy to talk a little bit briefly about the other ones when we get to the Q&A if you have questions. But of course, each of those is worth their own discussion in full. And I want to make sure, since I'm more of an expert in the press clause than the others, that we stay there. Um, Going back to the revolution, and in fact going back further, helps us understand the context in which debates about press freedom are occurring today. And I know all of you have probably seen in the news arrests of reporters, talks I just saw today of mergers of major media companies and what impact that might have on freedom of the press. So this is a story that is very much alive. And I think the story that we're looking back on in colonial and revolutionary America helps us understand what's going on and provide some clues about where we might be going. Um, it's not just one about politics, it's a story that's has long involved uh, business and commercial interests as well. But before we get just to that, let's go back to 150 years before the Revolution, and then let's cross the Atlantic to the east and go back to England, where printing developed in the English-speaking world well before it did in the American colonies. So throughout the 17th century, Parliament, the king, and printers battled over who should control the news. For much of the century, England had a licensing act which restricted the printing trade to a small guild known as the Stationers' Company and allowed printing to take place only in London and in the university towns of Oxford and Cambridge. The idea behind Parliament and the King, one thing they agreed on was that printing should be controlled, and judging just by those places, it's the seat of government and the seats of education and learning in the country. The concept of a free press developed in the English context during the English Civil War. I hope there are no 17th century English historians on the call. If there are, I apologize for describing a very complicated event in one sentence. But here we go for everybody else. At the heart of the English Civil War was a dispute between King Charles I and Parliament over whether Charles would be allowed to rule by divine right without the input of the legislature. Then you add in religious cleavages both between Catholics and Protestants, and also between Anglicans and Puritans, and you have the makings of a really awful conflict that lasted for decades, and that really isn't settled until the end of the 17th century. Enter John Milton, who, if you know the name, you probably know him from the epic poem Paradise Lost. In 1644, he engaged in this debate with a treatise called the Areopagitica, or at least that's how I think it's best pronounced, that argued against government censorship. So he accuses Charles I of engaging in that sort of behavior and likens him to the Pope. I read this treatise many years ago. I returned to it this fall as part of some new research and was stunned to be reminded of just how anti-Catholic this pamphlet is. The evil doer, the censor of speech for Milton, the real bogeyman, is the Catholic Church, is the Pope. And right, it's the moment of the Inquisition and other sort of examples where the English, who for the most part do not like Catholics in this era, are able to project all evil onto the Catholic Church. And then Milton very readily then says, well, Charles I, who is Catholic-like anyway and is trying to rule like a Catholic, is making these same decisions and censoring books, suppressing free expression, destroying free thought. And so he writes this, what becomes a very influential pamphlet over the years. It's still cited in legal briefs today about freedom of the press. And if you take out the anti-Catholic pieces, you're left with a stirring paean to freedom of speech. So he says, "Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience, above all liberties." That's it. That's the thing. However, it takes a while for that sort of freedom to take place. The first newspapers in England are published by authority. They're published by the government. So this is an example of the London Gazette, which is the official government newspaper. The goal was to serve as an organ of the monarchy, an organ of the government, and give updates on what the government was doing, its acts and its deeds. And that system held until 1695, when a licensing act that had been in place lapsed and was not replaced, not renewed. And so printing began to spread all across England very rapidly. Um, Lots of new newspapers in London, lots of newspapers across all sorts of other cities. So right in the late 17th, early 18th century is when you get the first newspapers in Bristol, in Plymouth, in York, in Edinburgh, in Dublin, in Cork, in all of these other British Empire cities. Um, and many of these new outlets specifically see themselves as in opposition to official power, right? You can read the London Gazette, that's the official news, or you can read this other paper that is going to worry about whether government officials are getting away with things that they shouldn't. We are going to serve as a check, an oppositional force against a potentially corrupt government. The same process plays out in the American colonies on a much smaller scale. The towns are much smaller, even by the Revolution, but 100 years earlier, they're still quite small. Printing requires a certain critical mass of population in a town. You have to have a certain number of people around for it to be worth printing 500 or 1,000 copies of a newspaper and trying to sell them. So early printing is actually concentrated in our area, in New England. The Puritans, settlers who came here first, uh, as the first English and European settlers, saw reading as a key part of their practice. So they wanted printing. They wanted to be able to have the written word, to study God's word, to read sermons, but they wanted to keep it under very tight control. Other colonies had even more to say about it. So Sir William Berkeley, who was governor of Virginia in the 1670s, and a wildly corrupt official, if I may add, famously wrote, I thank God that in Virginia there are no free schools nor printing, and I hope we shall not have these 100 years. For learning has brought disobedience and heresy and sects into the world, and printing has divulged them and libels against the best government. God keep us from both. Uh, as a result, Williamsburg, Virginia does not get printing until the early 1730s, well over a century after it was first settled by the English. First English newspaper was published in Boston, exactly one issue on September 25th, 1690, old style, by a man named Benjamin Harris. It appeared for only one issue because it was not published by authority. And Harris published unauthorized information in Massachusetts. The local colonial officials immediately suppressed it, and there were no other newspapers for another 14 years until 1704, when that's not the right one, until 1704, when John Campbell, who was the Boston postmaster, and being the postmaster was a key part of this story, began the Boston newsletter, and he published it very specifically on the header by authority. Like the London Gazette, these papers saw themselves essentially as chroniclers of official acts rather than as forums for debate about government policy. That starts to change in the 1720s when Boston became the site of multiple newspapers. This is when you get the introduction of the New England Courant. This is something that becomes a pattern across the American colonies. When a town can only support one newspaper, printers mostly tried to remove themselves from public view because that was often bad for business. If you can only support one newspaper to begin with, if you anger half of your customers, you don't have enough customers to support a business. Once the town is large enough, once there are enough political factions and strength in numbers and commercial activity to support two newspapers, then you can have some political partisanship. You can pick a political faction because they can support you against the other guys, whoever that might be. Um, But they still, printers, editors, and publishers still lacked really an idea of a free press. And James Franklin, his last name is familiar because he's the older brother of Benjamin, founded this newspaper, the New England Courant, in 17 in the late 1710s, early 1720s, and chose to specifically publish lots of literary items and lots of political news. Then he got involved in a political debate about smallpox. In 1721 to 23, there was a massive smallpox epidemic that struck Boston and killed hundreds. Um, Boston's government officials proposed to inoculate the population, which was deeply controversial because inoculation requires you to be given a slightly less deadly, but still be given the virus that you are being protected against. So you actually got smallpox when you were inoculated, which made it somewhat controversial. James and his compatriots led the impertinent opposition. They questioned the wisdom of inoculation. They criticized the judgment of town officials and elders, such as the famous Reverend Cotton Mather, who was one of the supporters of inoculation. And such insubordination was simply unacceptable. They left him alone for then, but a year later, he printed more criticism of the colonial government. This time, he alleged that the government was in cahoots with pirates. He found himself imprisoned. He wasn't permitted to print under his own name, so he went through a subterfuge and had his apprentice, his younger brother Benjamin, print the newspaper in his name instead. So from a very early age, one of the things we get from this incident is Benjamin Franklin getting an education in press freedom. Um, it shows us the limits of press freedom. There really isn't a lot except what the government allows you. Um, and it gets Ben Franklin to Philadelphia. So they, in order to have Benjamin be the printer of the newspaper, have his name on the newspaper, James releases him from his apprenticeship and has him sign a second secret apprenticeship. Um, and as soon as Benjamin, who is very upset about his older brother for a whole variety of things, decides he wants to leave, he essentially calls James's bluff and says, "You either have to reveal that this was all a mess, or you have to let me go." Franklin, when he moved to Philadelphia, took over the Pennsylvania Gazette, which became the third newspaper in that particular town. Um, he published essays that reflected a broad range of political opinions. But within a few years, he too got in trouble. In 1731, he angered some in Philadelphia by publishing an advertisement. So he gets in trouble over an advertisement, which is usually considered to be the text of someone else, um, that people found offensive to ministers. Um, Franklin responded in his newspaper, in the Gazette, on June 10th, 1731, with a statement that's become known as the Apology for Printers. And he basically goes through how difficult it is to be a printer. He said that they were scarce able to do anything in their way of getting a living, which shall not probably give offense to some. In order to stay in business, they couldn't publish only the opinions of with which they agreed, or, quote, there would be very little printed, besides what they themselves wrote. Franklin insisted that he had kept some material out of the press. He argued, "I have been discerning," in particular pieces that he described as those that might countenance vice or promote immorality. And that was true for him, even if he might have profited from publishing. So, what he proposed instead was that the press should be free and open. So, for him, a free press meant the following things. It essentially meant no government interference in the publication, no prior restraint, which is when the government prevents you from publishing something beforehand, and no censorship afterward. You can't gather up all of the publications and destroy them. Government can't interfere before, during, or after. That is a free press. An open press is one that is not partisan and that's available to all. It is the forum is the best word I have to describe this. That it's essentially creating the newspaper as a public venue, much like the public square, but in print. The printer served as the conduit for information. He, and in most cases it was a he, there were a few women, was responsible for keeping vitriol out of public debate, but otherwise he was only an instrument for conveying political opinions to the public. So this is where we get the terminology that printers would describe themselves as mere mechanics. Essentially, I'm just the guy who operates the press. I'm not the guy who's got the ideas. I'm the one who serves the ideas to the people. So many printers hold fast to this ideology. This is especially true in those one newspaper kind of towns. And in 1731, a number of people reprint Franklin's Apology, and in later years as well. But it also proves a really canny business strategy, and especially for somebody like Franklin, who's able to use that strategy to shape the content without shouldering blame. So Franklin is famous for writing either anonymously or pseudonymously in his newspaper. Um, Nobody knows it's him. If he mostly prints things from his friends and they're all published anonymously, he's just the printer. He's taking what comes into his office and printing that. So printers, sometimes it works, sometimes the sleight of hand does not work. And the other problem for printers is that they are the public face. I said this in passing, so let me say it quite clearly. Most things published in the newspapers were published without a name attached to them, unless it was an official government proclamation. So if there was a news item, there were no reporters with bylines. If it was a letter to the editor or an essay or things like that, either it would be published anonymously or it would be published as essay by a merchant of this town, or it would be published under a pseudonym. Um, the Federalist was published as Publius, or you might have heard of the Farmer, what we call the Pennsylvania Farmer essays, um, were signed simply a farmer, right? You'd have a pseudonym. And so the only name on the paper is the printer himself. The place where this becomes most famous is in 1735 when printer John Peter Zenger ran headlong into that problem. So he's a German immigrant who published essays attacking the then governor of New York, the colony of New York, William Cosby. Um, I did not come up with his name. That is his name. Um, he gets caught essentially in a political dispute among the elites of New York, and he is really actually working for one side. In his case, he's mostly just working for them. He's not particularly active figure himself. But Cosby supporters had Zenger jailed for seditious libel for printing mean things about the governor. They try to get an indictment against him and fail, so they use a backdoor way to get him brought up on charges. Uh, Zenger's supporters, the Morrisite faction in New York City, hire an incredibly famous defense lawyer from Philadelphia named Andrew Hamilton, no relation to the $10 guy, um, who argued in court that, contrary to existing law, truth was a legitimate defense against libel. Essentially, what he was saying was Zenger, or what was printed in Zenger's New York Weekly Journal, was true, and therefore it cannot be seditious libel. It can't be defamatory against the governor if it was true. And the jury bought it. Zenger was acquitted. Uh, and this is sort of where we stand. There's individual cases in the 1740s, 1750s that detail the ways in which this is that have the same sort of set of facts to them or same description to them. That starts to fray when we get into the 1760s and the imperial crisis. Um, Most important in thinking about this shift is the Stamp Act crisis, which provoked the first continent-wide protests against British policy. Uh, this was not a coincidence. I've argued this in writing and in many, many talks. The act most affected the business prospects of printers, those who produced the media that could broadcast protests to a very broad audience. So it covered documents and printed matter subject to a duty ranging from from a half a penny up to several pounds for a duty, which is for a particular document, which is quite significant. That is more than most working men earned in a year. So this is a printing of the law. Each paragraph is a different thing that's being taxed, and it has the marginal notes. This is two of about 15 pages of a list of things. So the things that were covered included legal proceedings, um, indentures, business documents, petitions, bills of lading and shipping documents. Also, newspaper, pamphlets, almanacs, playing cards, dice were also taxed. All of these things. Um, and the reason you could do that is because printers are actually a very clear place to go for money. They're easy to see. Um, Printers take offense to this. They lead the charge against the Stamp Act because even the ones who think it is constitutional that Parliament has the right to do so are deeply unhappy about having their business affected. So during some of the protests, they do things like print a newspaper with a gravestone, a headstone, just decoration on it. This is the Pennsylvania Journal of October 31st, 1765. My students sometimes think the decorations are for Halloween. They are not. The act was scheduled to take effect on November 1st. So October 31st is our last free newspaper. It is hard to see. I will see if I can. Oh, I don't think I can. On the right side of the page, sideways, if you tip your head or just let me read it, it says, "Adieu, adieu to the liberty of the press." The masthead of the paper says, "Expiring in hopes of a resurrection to life again." In the bottom right corner is where the stamp is supposed to be starting tomorrow, and instead there's a skull and crossbones. And I'll give you a little closer up view of that. It's an emblem of the effects of the stamp, as if that's not enough. You flip back to the back page to page 4, and in place of one of the advertisements is this little box with a coffin and an epitaph for the newspaper. The last remains of the Pennsylvania Journal, which departed this life the 31st of October, 1765, of a stamp in her vitals, aged 23 years. The problem for printers, the problem for Americans more broadly in 1765 is that they see printing as essential to their ability to communicate one another with one another, as essential to their ability to find out what was going on, especially in England. Much of the news, if you've heard me give another talk, much of the news comes from England in American newspapers. Um, and they're really starting to see and starting to push this idea that the press is a protection against tyranny. They still maintain, actually right up through the start of the Revolutionary War, that they are nonpartisan. So I give you a header from the Massachusetts Spy, which was the newspaper of Isaiah Thomas, who started in Boston and then moved to Worcester. And you can see his motto is open to all parties, but influenced by none, right? And that's sort of the nub, the key of the idea of an open press. Um, he, of course, doesn't say here that he's largely funded by John Hancock and is in league with the Sons of Liberty and the Patriots of Boston. Um, he's a very active player. He is not anybody's pawn by any stretch of the imagination, but a lot of his funding for his office to get started comes from Hancock. He is a partisan figure, um, but proclaims himself not to be. Uh, what they're doing essentially, and you may have heard this phrase too, is that they see the press as a bulwark of liberty. So for those of you who are not familiar with 18th century military terms, a bulwark is a defensive works. It's a could be a wall, could be a earthen defense, but it's a defensive military um, buildup. Um, they get that idea from something called Cato's Letters, which were written in 1720 to 1722 by two uh, British journalists, Trenchard and Gordon. Trenchard was definitely John. I'm forgetting what Gordon was, but it likely was John too. Um, and what they say in the 15th of what was well over 100 of these letters is freedom of speech is the great bulwark of liberty. They prosper and die together, and it is the terror of traitors and oppressors and a barrier against them. So this comes out of an idea that became very popular during the Revolutionary era as they start to worry about Parliament and as they see or project corruption onto Parliament, that the press is the way to expose them. The newspapers exist to protect the colonists from officials in London, whether parliamentary or government ministers, to protect them from officials in their own colonies who were sent by the imperial governments, sent by London to rule over them in the colonies. And so this idea of the press as a bulwark just becomes extraordinarily popular and becomes a sort of new way of thinking about it's not a forum, right? It's not open for everybody. It's now a bulwark. It is specifically positioning itself as outside of government and oppositional to government, as standing on the side of the people and protecting the people from a government, right? This is all sort of a philosophy that says that government is dangerous and that the people need protection. Didn't want to quite do that yet. My apologies. Um, Once fighting starts, that begins to fall apart, as you might imagine. And there are cases, both of patriots and loyalist printers who found their presses attacked. Once the war starts, they are instruments of war as much as anything else, instruments of propaganda. In New York, the most famous loyalist printer was a man named James Rivington. His press was attacked and destroyed in late 1775 by a group of patriots, actually a group of patriots from Connecticut. Um, and I was born and raised in the New York City suburbs, and so I understood as I was reading the sources. The New York City Patriots were actually upset that this had happened, and it really spoke to me as somebody who grew up in the suburbs. They were mostly upset that somebody from Connecticut had come down and taken care of what they thought of as their own guy to handle and deal with. Um, in Virginia, the British attack the press of a man named John Hunter Holt in Norfolk, Virginia, um, and destroy it. Um, the British and Americans are constantly stealing each other's presses if they invade a town because they're useful for printing and for spreading information. Um, as the idea of the bulwark takes hold, at the same time, Americans are declaring independence as a nation in Philadelphia in 1776, and also then writing constitutions at the state level. Um, each of the states writes a constitution before 1787. Um, I would include Vermont in that, which is not admitted as part of the United States, but which declares its own independence in 1777 and writes a constitution. Um, eight of the constitutions offer protection to the press in a Declaration of Rights in some part of the Constitution. That includes our very own Massachusetts, which the first draft of the Constitution was written by John Adams. So Article 16 of the Declaration of Rights, and that's in our state's Constitution. The liberty of the press is essential to the security of freedom in a state. It ought not, therefore, to be restrained in this Commonwealth. Pennsylvania is the only one that actually links speaking and writing. The people have a right to freedom of speech and of writing and publishing their sentiments. Therefore, the freedom of the press ought not to be restrained. South Carolina, I guess, was more restrained in its language. All it says is the liberty of the press be inviolably preserved. They're really conceptualizing the press as something that's a core institution of public civic life. Problem is, they win the war. Uh, which is to say that as of 1783, instead of living in a potentially tyrannical empire where the real forces of power are thousands of miles away and outside of the control of the people, Americans now live in a republic or 13 republics. So what do you do? What role should the press play in a free society when the government is representative of society? When the people of Massachusetts under the state constitution are electing their own representatives and have recourse for potential tyranny of going to elect somebody else because they're not being going to just be sent somebody else appointed from London. So this becomes a very fraught and difficult question of what role exactly the press is supposed to play in a republic, because the whole thing, theoretically, is set up as a bulwark of liberty, and to borrow that phrase. So ideologically, they're really struggling and processing. At the same time, they're trying to go through some practical uh, things, like, for example, paying for the war. And it turns out that a Stamp Act was an effective way to tax in 1765, and it's an effective way to tax in 1785. So Massachusetts actually passed the legislature, the general court, passes a new stamp tax in 1785 on Massachusetts newspapers. These are the representatives elected by Massachusetts voters, go to Boston and say, we need to raise more money. The way to do it is through a tax on newspapers, because newspapers are identifiable. Printers are a locatable industry. They're quantifiable. They can be calculated. Uh, Matthew Carey, who's actually an Irish immigrant to Philadelphia, uh, writes passionately, in very broad and abstract terms, that the freedom of the press, against this act, that the freedom of the press was the palladium of all the rights, privileges, and immunities, dear or sacred to any body of men worthy to rank above the brute creation. And then again, he comes back. He himself actually is an Irish Catholic. He's a fascinating guy who also deserves his own talk. Um, but he again makes this kind of comparison that the stamp tax in Massachusetts, there's no difference between that and a Spanish licenciado, a French privilège du roi, an Oxford imprimatur, an English stamp, and a Massachusetts advertisement tax. They're all the same. Um, Massachusetts printers themselves argue against the tax vociferously. Essentially, they argue that no one's going to buy a Massachusetts newspaper anymore. They'll get their newspapers from Rhode Island or New Hampshire or Vermont or Connecticut, and it is eventually defeated. Uh, which brings me back in time to the First Amendment. We're not quite done. Um, don't get too excited just yet. Uh, 1787, the US Constitution gets passed, sent to the states. State ratifying conventions approve the document eventually. Many of the state ratifying conventions, the way to get them to vote yes is to attach proposed amendments, among which are several of the suggestions from different states involve freedom of the press in some way, shape, or form. In 1789, when they get to New York for the first Congress, James Madison, architect of the Constitution, who in 1787 said it didn't need a Bill of Rights, is elected to the House of Representatives and sits down to bring all of these together, eventually getting through Congress, 12 of which 10 were ratified in 1791, including this First Amendment. Now, as I said, and I said it as a joke at the beginning, the day after this gets ratified, they're fighting about what it means. They don't know what a republic looks like. They don't have examples. Some of the early members of the government have a lot of affection for the British system of government. Some have very little. They've read a lot, and they're making things up as they go. So just to give you one example, we have the amendments as this sort of bracketed off text. There actually was a debate in 1789 about whether they should be interlined within the existing Constitution. And boy, would the Constitution look very different if this amendment was actually just stuck in the middle of Article 1 somewhere instead of being pulled out as a separate. But they have to figure that out. The Constitution doesn't say. They then spend the 1790s arguing about what it means, arguing about what role the press should serve. Um, the Federalists, the party that's not really led by Washington, but is led by Adams, Hamilton, um, and others, essentially argues that the public represents its opinion through voting. You vote for your members of the House of Representatives, you vote for your state legislators, they vote for members of the US Senate. That's it, that's your voice. You then have to trust in a republic that they will do a good job. And when their term is up in 1 or 2 or 4 or 6 years, you get another chance to vote. Democratic Republicans, who eventually becomes a party of sorts, led by people like Jefferson and Madison himself, who shifts away from the Federalists, argue that public opinion is urgently needed constantly. They stick to this bulwark of liberty idea that the press, even in a republic, needs to have a watchful eye at all times on what the government is doing, that it has a right to comment on public actions and public servants and public officials. And so you get this back and forth of, is this an appropriate act? Is even dissent itself, is it okay to dissent from government policy? Is that simply arguing against the government policy, or is that destructive of the government's authority overall? Uh, and I will add here that they had in their minds, there are many things that people feel about the 250th anniversary this year. Um, Most of the members of the founding generation would have been stunned that the thing has lasted this long. They were very much expecting it all to collapse very quickly. And so the idea that dissent could destroy the government itself, um, we can have sympathy for that idea or not, but for them it was a very present idea. And it takes us to 1798, which is another moment of military crisis and diplomatic crisis with France. A very federalist Congress passes the Sedition Act. They also passed multiple Alien Acts, an Alien Friends Act and an Alien Enemies Act, um, both of which are also have been in the news for the last year or so. Um, the Sedition Act makes it illegal to, quote, write, print, utter, or publish any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States or either House of Congress of the United States or the President of the United States with intent to defame. Now, those of you who are careful, close readers will notice that there is one federal official left out of this list. That's the vice president. In 1798, the president was a Federalist, John Adams. The vice president was a Republican, Thomas Jefferson. Perfectly okay, the Federalists said, to take swings at Jefferson. Now, one of the problems with this act, or one of the underlying causes of this act, is that the Republicans, who unhelpfully are the ancestors of the modern Party, the Republican Party of today comes from the 1850s, not from the 1790s. Uh, they were basically, they were much better at newspapers than the Federals because they believed so strongly in public opinion. They had developed lots of really good newspapers and a really good network of newspapers across the United States. Um, and so they were beating the Federalists at the public opinion game, and this was part of the reaction of the Federalists. Um, when we teach it today, it is hard not to say that it's facially unconstitutional. It is a restriction on the freedom of the press. It was used to prosecute a number of people. Um, it, my apologies. Um, it also had a sunset on it of 1801. And so when it sunsets, it is not renewed. Um, but what stays on the books are the state sedition acts and state libel laws, which continue to be an issue through the 19th into the 20th and frankly even the 21st century, that there are laws um, that govern and regulate the press. So obviously, since 1776, in the 250 years, and in the 230 or so years since the Sedition Act, the press and news media have changed significantly, and I'm happy to talk about some of the differences as we shift into the conversation and the Q&A. Um, but what's clear to me is that there are these two models at the founding moment, in the founding era, um, both of which see the press as a really crucial component of allowing for an informed public and allowing for a vibrant and rich civic life, of making democracy possible, of making it possible for citizens to govern themselves. Uh, whether it is the free and open idea of free of government interference and open to all parties, or the bulwark of liberty, where it is set up more oppositionally to government. Either way, the lesson that we may draw in thinking about it is that what the founders intended, what the founding generation intended, was really a press that wanted to be at a distance from the government, was part of a rich civic life, and was able to keep an eye and create the conditions for a healthy democracy. That is where I will leave things. I think I may have talked too fast, and for that, I apologize. I have a couple of ways to contact me, which I'll leave up for 30 seconds, and then I will stop the share, and I'm happy to take some questions and talk about the press.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Adelman. And I welcome any questions that people have, if you'd like to drop them in the chat. And while we're waiting, excuse me, I did have a quick question for you. In the Sedition Act that you just shared, could you go after, or at the time, could they go after the judicial branch? Because I didn't see them listed in the act, so I'm kind of curious.
Yes, you're right. They could have gone after the judicial branch. I think I'm not a historian of the courts, so I will lean on my general sentiment of the period, which is that they didn't think a whole lot about the courts at all. It was not. It takes a long time for people to see the court and for the court to present itself as the final arbiter, or so certainly Supreme Court and federal courts more generally, as the final arbiter of the Constitution and as a significant player, in the political world. So yeah, they could go after the courts, but nobody was thinking of. Sadly, they weren't thinking about them very much.
Okay. Well, I'm going to build on that because we have a question. Uh,
Uh-huh.
the Sedition Act requires an actual statement to be false and have intent to defame. Isn't that consistent with today's actual malice standard?
Okay. Thank you, Andrea, for that question. And apologies. I know Andrea's Andreas and Andreas, so my apologies actually if I picked the wrong pronunciation. Um, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a PhD trained historian. Um, so I will be careful in how I answer this question. The intent to defame is a lower standard than actual malice. And the way that courts treat um, actual malice for public figures today is actually a very significant bar, much higher actually than in most other countries. And this goes back, I don't know how familiar people are with random Supreme Court decisions, but New York Times v. Sullivan is the free press decision. Um, it has to be not just false, but knowingly false. And right, the actual malice standard is significantly higher than just trying to say something bad about somebody. Um, it's that it's false, knowingly false, and aggressively published in the face of being knowingly false. Um, where you couldn't say, well, I wasn't sure. I printed this letter from a merchant in town and he made the claim, but you're responsible for it. Um, that is a lower standard than what the courts would hold today.
Hmm. Okay. All right. Mary asked, do other countries promote freedom of the press?
Yes. Um, depending on what you mean by press, freedom, and promote. Um, sorry, I couldn't resist. The answer is yes, of course, and it's contextual. Many of the countries of Europe and certainly the former British Empire and um, actually mostly not British, um, absolutely promote freedom of the press in very different ways. So in my head, as I was talking about the actual malice standard, um, Britain has a lower standard and a much tighter leash on news organizations about statements about public figures. I know I couldn't go very deep into the details about it, but it is much easier for public figures, celebrities, government officials to make claims against media organizations in the UK because of the way they're standard. But many nations have a tradition of a free press. Many nations um, aspire to a free press. And after that, it's very context dependent exactly how that manifests.
Mhm. Okay. We have another question from Joel. Saying that the president lies and gives examples, is this defamation?
Um, not a lawyer. I'm sorry. I recognize that I drew you all in, and I want to talk about free press as a historical issue when I have some ideas about the law. Um, I am not going to offer. I can't offer to defend you, Joel, if you get in trouble. Um, the the short answer is no, according to the practices of the United States for the last 200 odd years. Um, and there's a popular genre of publishing fact checkers after speeches by not only the president but by other major figures in the American political scene, and saying this was a lie, here's the evidence, this was a lie, here's the evidence. The principle and the law as it stands today is no, that's not defamatory or libelous because you back it up with evidence. If you're making a true statement, um, you are protected under the First Amendment
Okay. Yes, it sort of reminds
for
me of
public figures.
it sort of reminds me of I think when Trump's first presidency, his some of his State of the Unions were fact checked in real time by NPR, if I remember
Mhm.
correctly. So they were doing something along those lines. But it also, if we're talking current politics outside of this country, what happened in the Philippines with and I wish I could remember her name, the journalist who was
Um,
eventually
Mar-
ousted.
Maria Ressa?
Yeah, her name, I do believe it began with an R. M. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean that's the list of countries that have um violated principles of a free press is long.
Mhm.
Um, and Rodrigo Duterte, I think, is the president of the Philippines, has
Yes.
made very clear that criticism and um, opposition is unwelcome. Um, yeah, I know very little. I know very little about the Philippines, so I'm going
Yeah.
based on the same news reports that you've read. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of sentiment against the press, precisely because it can serve these functions.
Mhm. Right. Okay, so Joel had an add-on question. Uh, what is the so-called lie? I think it's what if the so-called lies are not proven? Is this defamation? And I'm gonna. Well, I don't want to add to that question exactly, but I'm kind of curious as to what not proven might be. I mean, certainly what we've heard, certain statements come, even as recently as the State of the Union you know, President Trump made statements that were could not be proven.
Uh, this is what lawyers get paid for, is to
Yeah, right. So yeah, I think it's a little difficult for you to
it's
answer
yeah, no,
that
I mean,
one.
this
Yeah.
is the point where I say if I went to law school and I had a set of facts in front of me, sure, I could give you
Okay.
more of a detailed answer, but I'm sorry to be frustratingly vague, but the real answer is this is what the lawyers would hash out if somebody filed a
Mhm.
lawsuit.
Right. All right. Well, I'm going to give you a different question. You mentioned earlier in your talk how much of the colony's news actually came out of the UK. Now,
Yeah,
I would imagine that would place, whatever news came out really wouldn't be new any longer by the time it reached the US.
but it was new to
So,
them.
well, yes, but was there anything that was done to sort of I don't know that you could actually, make up for the time lag, so to speak. I mean, was there anything in place to sort of help? Um, I don't know, in some way. I don't know how to put it exactly, but I sort of imagine that there were more presses to make,
Uh-huh.
news easier or quicker to get out. But what do you do in the case where the news you're getting is from weeks away?
Um, a couple of things. So, first I will say the standard thing I say is they lived in a world where nothing could move faster, and no one expected that anything could move faster than a really well-built sailing ship on water or a really fast horse on land.
Mhm,
They found that frustrating, right? They recognized the time lag, but they lived in a world where they didn't right anything telephones right like when the telegraph was invented in the 1840s, it was described as the annihilation of space and time, right? That's they lived in a world where you can't move faster than a really fast ship. It takes 6 weeks to get from Boston um to London. Actually, going that way, it's a little faster because of the Gulf Stream. It takes 4 to 5 weeks to get there. It takes 5 or 6 to get back.
mhm,
It's baked into anything. So that's the sort of baseline is they live in a world where they don't planes, smartphones, like they can't conceptualize
mhm,
the instantaneous communication. So they recognize that they live in a world of delays. So part is that they are frustrated by it. They also accept that the news that's arriving from 6 weeks ago is what they would call the freshest advices. We're going to keep you up to date. So what can you do? You do a couple things. One, um, you can pay people to make sure that the person bringing the news is on a faster, better built ship
mhm,
that actually leaves on time. So they set up, the British government sets up official, what they're called packet boats. They're basically monthly voyages from New York to London with mail. those go once a month. I don't remember exactly what day of the month it is, but if you have something the day after it's left, you gotta wait a month to send it. So if you can afford to send it on a merchant ship tomorrow, off you go, you're going faster. Um, right? They will do so this becomes most apparent at the big events. Um, After the Boston Tea Party, they want the news to get out fast. They put Paul Revere on a horse, and he rides night and day till he gets to Philadelphia, twice as fast as you normally can. It takes him 1 week instead of two. Um, and I know it feels like that on I-95 sometimes now, but that's what you do. You hire somebody, you make sure it's getting out on the first boat. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, the British government in Boston and the Patriots race to get their version of the news onto a ship headed to London so their account gets there first. Right, those are the kinds of things you can do. You can make sure if you're a printer, if you're an editor, if you're corresponding with people across the ocean, that you have consistent correspondence. Sometimes ships get lost. You send two copies. Right. So there's all sorts of ways and things that they can do in the context of they live in a world where they know that in Boston they're finding out essentially what happened. They're 6 weeks behind, sort of by definition, of what's going on in London.
Mhm. Good. All right. We've got one last question tonight. How often have presidents restricted freedom of the press by declaring an emergency?
Yeah, I know this is a hot topic. I am struggling to think of a specific example um, of the type that's being discussed as a possibility now, where the president might declare an emergency that would specifically restrict the press. However, um, it would not be new for the government to try and control information in any number of ways. Um, that is absolutely true in war times, the Civil War, World War I and World War II, right? Um, the government tries to control the information it wants to control.
Mhm.
Um, and whether that's an officially declared emergency or not, that has been something that governments have tried to do. I mean, there are ways in which the press plays along, right? There are the press had the State of the Union was 2 nights ago. It was Tuesday night. Um, Members of the press had that speech Tuesday afternoon, but with an embargo, with an agreement that they wouldn't publish any of the
Mhm.
text of it until after Trump said it out loud in the
Mhm.
well of the House, right? They'll do all sorts of things, but it is extreme to declare an emergency that would specifically restrict the press, and I'm struggling to think of a specific example that would be that way. But it's an extreme of a spectrum that presidents, governments have been playing along for 200 years.
Is there any chance that maybe FDR and Nixon may have done something like this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think of the specifics of FDR during World War II, but
He
they were
wouldn't have done
constantly
anything. Oh, sorry.
I mean, they were constantly working the press to try and make sure that there was. So it's not restricting the freedom of the press in the way that we're thinking of it as don't print this, but they're
Hmm.
constantly working the press, especially in wartime. Don't print this, uh, because it might help the enemy. Don't, do print that. Don't print this.
Uh-huh.
Um, during World War II, they're censoring the mail. Um,
Would they have put out more press releases to influence what was being published?
yes, and that would have been more. World War II is one of the moments in time when that would have been more possible
Hmm.
because of the way the press was organized in the 1940s.
Hmm.
That would be impossible today, right? That is impossible today,
Hmm.
right? If you think back to the events last month in Minnesota, and the two killings of protesters,
Hmm.
the federal government issued press releases, but there were 100 cell phone videos out even before they'd finished typing the press release,
Hmm.
right? Which just changes the nature of what it even means to control. Um, and since we're getting towards the end, I'll open a huge can of worms. What's a journal in 2026? What is a journalist? I've,
Great
I've,
question.
I've
I
talked to
mean,
journalists. I've talked to lawyers. They don't agree on what it is,
oh, okay. Well,
on what makes a journalist a journalist.
I feel like we're hearing the term or the rise of the term of the citizen journalist, right? I mean, we all have cameras.
But does a citizen with a camera enjoy the protections of the press clause?
Ah, good question. All right. Well, you know what? I think we're gonna
This
have
is
you
this is
back to
this is
answer
what the
that.
yeah, this is what the lawyers that I talk to get paid more to think about than I do.
All right. Well, I'm going to invite you to come back and answer that question for us on another
Sure.
talk. And I think that is a great question to ask. And I'm sure there will be a lot of opinions about it. I mean,
Yeah, and there's yeah.
yeah. I mean, I think of the case recently, also in, I think it was Minnesota or Minneapolis, of the person who considered himself a citizen journalist and was visiting those daycare centers. The Somali run daycare centers and claiming, well, they must be, corrupted in some way because they're not answering my knock on the door when uh, what daycare center would let in a complete stranger? You know, to an,
And I will be annoying and separate out the question of whether I forget what the guy's name is, as you do, whether he enjoys constitutional protections for what he was doing is a different question from whether you think what he was doing was right, and is a
Mhm.
different question from whether you approve of it.
Right. All right. Well, great discussion tonight. Thank you so much for coming
Yeah,
out.
thank you all for coming, and yeah,
Yeah, thank you all for coming out tonight. And if you're interested in watching this again, I will have it up on YouTube probably before the end of the night. So, my night at least. All right. Well, thanks again, everyone. Have a great night. And hope to have you again soon for our next talk. It'll be the Boston molasses flood. So, should be a good one. All right. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.